Howdy, I'm Garrett Myler, the owner of Enclave Defense. This video is a somewhat abridged reenactment of a presentation I gave for the International Society of Automation at their Cybersecurity Standards Implementation Conference held in June of 2022. The topic was understanding the risk of conflating cyber threats, vulnerabilities, and tactics. Now, if you've never attended one of my presentations or trainings before, the title of this one may have clued you into the fact that I like to incorporate pop cultural references. Even if you've never seen the 1993 stoner movie Dazed and Confused, I hope you're still able to appreciate the references and find them amusing. In fact, I've gone so far to make some minor adjustments to this scene from the movie so that it better applies to the topic of lacking confidence over the meanings of words. Let's watch.
You a threat, man?
Like how?
Okay. Hey, man, wait up.
He was just asking if...
You're malicious.
Yeah, like...
Hack computers?
Yeah. I never have before, but...
Now, every time I talk about cyber risk or any of the variables that contribute to it, I believe it's useful to quickly provide a high-level review to make sure we're all on the same page. It's true that this could be considered a back-to-basics topic, but as I'll discuss toward the end of my presentation, I've learned the hard way that there are too many in our community that are getting this wrong. As you may know, 62443 Part 3-2 deals with risk assessment, so let's look at how it defines risk. It says risk is the expectation of loss expressed as the likelihood that a particular threat will exploit a particular vulnerability with a particular consequence. Below the definition, you see the equation typically used to express the variables of cyber risk. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times consequence. But as you see in the example risk matrix to the right, it only has two variables, not three. That's because, as indicated by the definition, likelihood captures both threat and vulnerability because what have you assessed the likelihood of? The answer, of course, is a particular threat exploiting a particular vulnerability. While I have the risk formula up, I want to stress the importance of understanding and accurately assessing each variable. Because if you get just one variable wrong, that error is literally multiplied and poisons the rest of your assessment of risk. With a high-level overview of the variables of risk out of the way, let's dig deeper, starting with what exactly we mean when we talk about threats. First, I want to introduce a new reference, NIST Special Publication 800-30. Now, when I say new, I don't mean that it recently came out. It's a decade old. But this is a key reference because, as we'll see in the next slide, it and the risk principles highlighted therein served as a primary resource in the development of 62443 Part 3-2. And 800-30 provides this model on the right and says that the word threat is actually a combination of a threat source and a threat event. Now here's where things start to get interesting. Part 3-2 and 800-30 basically use the same definition for threat, which is a circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact organizational operations and/or assets. While Part 3-2 only defines threat, 800-30 also gives a definition for a threat event, which is an event or situation that has the potential for causing undesirable consequences or impact. I use color to demonstrate that these definitions are, for all intents and purposes, the same. Now we're beginning to see why some may be dazed and confused about exactly what the threat portion of the risk equation is supposed to represent. Recall that 800-30 said that a threat is a combination of a threat event and a threat source. Again, Part 3-2 doesn't provide a definition for threat source, also known as a threat actor or threat agent. So we'll use 800-30's definition, which is the intentional or accidental method that exploits a vulnerability. Personally, I think the use of the word method is an interesting choice here. I can't help but wonder if the 800-30 authors were talking about how a threat source is the thing that exploits a vulnerability, but figured thing didn't sound professional enough, so they went with method. 800-30 also states that threat events are caused by threat sources. So what does a threat source do to cause a threat event? Well, they exploit one or more vulnerabilities. So what is a vulnerability? Fortunately, this is more straightforward than threats. The simplified definition of vulnerability provided by Part 3-2 is a flaw or weakness in a system that could be exploited, which is essentially the same definition used in 800-30. So now that we've looked deeper into these risk variables, let's revisit the 800-30 model with hopefully a more enlightened perspective. The model shows that a threat source initiates a threat event, but from the defender's perspective, measuring their risk, what exactly is the threat source doing to initiate a threat event? They exploit a vulnerability. And seeing as 800-30 effectively uses the same definition for threat and threat event, I'm proposing that this model is made more clear if we make the following changes. Remember, these changes for the 800-30 model were inspired by their own definitions and explanations, which we just covered. Namely, that a threat source causes a threat event, vulnerabilities are exploited by threat sources, and that a threat event causes an adverse consequence or impact. So when we look at the risk equation, it's arguably helpful to understand that risk equals the threat source times the vulnerability it's exploiting times the resulting consequence. Consequently, likelihood is the likelihood of the threat event, which happens when a particular threat source exploits a particular vulnerability, which goes right along with Part 3-2's definition of risk that we covered earlier. As an added benefit to our new understanding of threat, we can further break down our threat source as the sum of their capabilities and motivation. Notice I said sum and not product, because even if a threat source doesn't have malicious motives or intent, they can still be a capable threat source, like maybe a sysadmin having a bad day and making a mistake. And as we look at the breakdown of a threat source, hopefully it looks familiar and gives you a better appreciation for why security levels are such a big deal in 62443. They are essentially a reflection of the threat source you're defending against. Okay, so what about threat actor tactics and techniques? It's not one of the three variables of risk, so why do I bring it up? Well, I bring it up because these are often mistaken as either threats or vulnerabilities. The reason for this mix-up is because tactics and techniques explain how or the means by which a threat source exploits a vulnerability. In other words, threat tactics and techniques describes the exploitation that sits between the threat source and the vulnerability. The MITRE ATT&CK framework serves as sort of a database of threat tactics and techniques. Now, I'm sure some of y'all are getting weary of talking about these pie-in-the-sky risk principles, so let's use last year's breach of the water treatment plant in Oldsmar, Florida as an example of a specific threat actor using specific tactics to exploit a specific vulnerability. I've actually produced the following reenactment of the Oldsmar breach. Let's watch.
On Friday morning at about 8 o'clock, a plant operator at the Oldsmar water treatment facility noticed that someone remotely accessed the computer system that he was monitoring. This computer system controls the chemicals and other operations of the water treatment plant. The computer system was set up with a software program that allows for remote access where authorized users can troubleshoot system problems from other locations. The remote access at 8 o'clock on Friday morning was brief, and the operator didn't think much of it because his supervisor and others will remotely access his computer screen to monitor the system at various times. So nothing else happened from that initial intrusion at about 8 o'clock on Friday morning until about 1:30, when someone again remotely accessed the computer system, and it showed up on the operator's screen with a mouse being moved about to open various software functions that control the water being treated in the system. The person remotely accessed the system for about 3 to 5 minutes, opening various functions on the screen. One of the functions opened by the person hacking into the system was one that controls the amount of sodium hydroxide in the water. The hacker changed the sodium hydroxide from about 100 parts per million to 11,100 parts per million. This is obviously a significant and potentially dangerous increase. Sodium hydroxide, also known as lye, is the main ingredient in liquid drain cleaners. It's also used to control water acidity and remove metals from drinking water in the water treatment plants. After the intruder increased the parts per million from 100 to 11,100, the intruder exited the system, and the plant operator immediately reduced the level back to the appropriate amount of 100. Because the operator noticed the increase and lowered it right away, at no time was there a significant adverse effect on the water being treated. Importantly, the public was never in danger.
One detail I didn't include about the incident was that OSINT research done by Cyber News found 13 credential pairs linked to the plant in a list containing multiple billions of previously leaked passwords that had been released on the dark web just days earlier, just days before the attack. So for this cyber attack, what was the threat source? Well, it doesn't appear attribution is known, or at least it's not reported anywhere. So in my reenactment, I depicted it as script kiddies from Brazil. That, of course, is just a wild guess based on the fact that it didn't take much skill to pull this attack off. And while the amount of lye in the water supply would have been bad, to me it just seemed like the hacker was just goofing around. Okay, so what was the vulnerability? Well, being connected to the internet without a firewall is certainly one. The other one was poor credential practices. The tactic or techniques the threat source used to exploit these vulnerabilities was the exploiting of TeamViewer, a public-facing application, by using credential stuffing, most likely. And you see it here mapped to the MITRE attack framework. Another real-world example I'm aware of is an organization that decided to adopt the Stride threat model. Stride was a threat model developed by a couple of guys from Microsoft back in 1999. Now consider for a moment how much cyber threat intelligence has matured in the past 23 years. Well, Stride is an acronym that represents 6 different quote-unquote threats: spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and escalation of privilege. But should these 6 things even be called threats, or are they actually tactics and techniques? Well, let's reference the MITRE attack framework. Sure enough, spoofing is something hackers do in the process of exploiting vulnerabilities, so MITRE attack called them techniques. Breaking non-repudiation by manipulating PKI certs is also a technique, not a threat source. Privilege escalation is also a tactic with various sub-techniques. Tampering with operational ICS data to manipulate control or what an operator sees on the HMI, information disclosure, and denial of service are interesting because they are all more appropriately associated with impact, which the attack framework includes impacts as a sort of final or culminating action on target or tactic. So I hope through this presentation you are able to gain a better understanding of the meaning and differences of threat sources, vulnerabilities, the threat events that happen when a threat source exploits one or more vulnerabilities, and the tactics and techniques threat actors use to exploit them. The real-world examples I provided highlight what risk assessment mistakes you can avoid with this clear understanding of the cyber risk variables. Because being dazed and confused about cyber risk is just not cool, man. Since this is just a recording, if you have questions or just want to continue this conversation, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or you can email me at garrett@enclavedefense.com. Thank you.